The morning following the disappearance of Elmer the goldfish in the school swimming pool, Jennings leapt out of bed at the first note of the rising bell and roused the sleeping Derbyshire with an impatient jerk of the sheet. As a rule, they rose in a leisurely manner and spent some time practising clove hitches with their dressing-gown cords, but today urgent work lay ahead. Venables, Atkinson and Temple, with whom they shared dormitory 4, had only arrived at the yawning and head-scratching stage when Jennings and Darbishire hurried from the room. Jennings went for the key while Darbishire fetched his butterfly net from the games room. "I've botched the hole up a bit," he said as they met outside the swimming pool. Jennings fumbled with the lock and stepped over the threshold. "It ought to be pretty easy to catch Elmer now the ground bait's had time to work," said Jennings. "So all we've got to do is lure him to the side, and I'll lean over and—" "Oh, crumbs! Darby! Look!" Derbyshire was looking. Little pools of water lay in hollows all along the bottom of the empty swimming pool. Of Elmer there was no sign. "This is ozzard," moaned Darbishire. "He must have gone down the drain with the water. Gosh, what a frantic bish! Whatever will Bromo say?" "Quite a lot, I expect," Jennings answered unhappily. "After all, how would you feel if someone told you that your next of kin had gone down the plug hole?" During breakfast, Jennings thought hard. The best course of action, he decided, would be to find out what happened to the swimming pool water when it flowed away. Until then, it would be wiser to say nothing, for Bromwich had the mumps, and one must never alarm an invalid in a delicate state of health. After breakfast, and during break, Jennings made a few guarded inquiries, and one of the gardeners told him all he needed to know. The water was carried underground by pipes until it emerged in a ditch near the pond. Then it flowed across a meadow which the boys seldom used, for this part of the school grounds was rented by a neighbouring farmer. Wednesday was a half-holiday, and immediately after lunch, Jennings and Darbishire set out on their errand of mercy. They passed the pond and followed the ditch across the meadow, examining every foot of water as they went. "Come on, Darby, we've got to follow this ditch till we get to the end of it, wherever that is." "That'll be about another 100 miles, I expect," said Darbishire. He removed his spectacles and polished them with his tie. "Oh, gosh, isn't this a ghastly hoo-ha? There's just about everything you can think of in this ditch. Frogs and toads and newts and stinging nettles and old boots. Everything except a goldfish." Derbyshire replaced his glasses, and his gaze wandered listlessly round the meadow. "Are we out of bounds?" "No, we're still on school property," Jennings told him. "Only we don't come here because Farmer Arrowsmith uses it to graze his cow. Oh, yes, I believe I can see it. Oh, gosh, Jen, she's coming over here. I'm not very fond of cows. I've got a sort of feeling about them." "You must be like my Aunt Angela," mused Jennings. "She has the same sort of feeling about cats. She hates them. She can always tell when there's a cat in the room." "Well, I could always tell if there's a cow in the room," retorted Derbyshire, and he sidled towards a tree whose branches offered shelter in case of attack. "Don't be such a great funk, Darby," snorted Jennings contemptuously. "You don't want to be afraid of a harmless old—" He broke off and glanced at the cow with sudden misgiving. She was charging towards the boys as fast as her horny hooves would permit. Jennings stared. This cow was not friendly. Perhaps she held strong views on the laws of trespass. Perhaps she felt as strongly about boys as Derbyshire felt about cows. Perhaps he ceased his speculations and joined his friend in the lower branches of the tree. The cow arrived at the tree and mooed at them from below. Then, as nothing happened, she thudded away again to the far side of the meadow. Once she was out of sight, and they considered it safe, Jennings and Darbishire began to climb down. "Hey, you boys!" boomed a voice. The sort of voice that would be highly commended in any competition for town criers. "Oh, golly," muttered Jennings. "We've had it now. It's old Wilkie." The boys climbed down the tree and stood guiltily before the assistant master. "What on earth were you doing up there?" boomed Mr. Wilkins. We were looking for a fish, sir." "What? Up a tree?" "Well, yes and no, sir. What I mean is, I've had quite enough of this insolence. You'll go straight back to school and report to me in the staff room." Mr. Carter was alone when Jennings opened the staff room door and asked, "Sir, is Mr. Wilkins here, please, sir?" It seemed rather a pointless question to Mr. Carter, for the staff room was sparsely furnished, and the chances that his colleague was hiding behind the bookcase were remote. He pointed this out, adding, "By the way, Jennings, when you find Mr. Wilkins, will you tell him that swimming is cancelled this afternoon? Robinson's cleaning the pool out. You probably won't believe it, but he tells me that when he went there at 6:30 this morning, he found—" "A goldfish, sir?" suggested Jennings, before he had time to stop himself. "Well, well," said Mr. Carter, "I might have known you had something to do with it. You'd better tell me what happened." Jennings was thankful for the opportunity. His troubles had been preying heavily on his mind. There was a punishment, of course. No swimming for a week for going to the pool without permission. "You're very lucky, Jennings," concluded Mr. Carter. "Yes, sir," mumbled Jennings, sadly. "If it hadn't been for the strainer over the drain, you'd have lost your fish altogether," said Mr. Carter. "You mean the fish is all right then, sir?" Jennings gasped in wonder. "Perfectly. Robinson found it flapping about in a puddle near the strainer, and put it in the kettle that the night watchman uses for his tea. It's in the woodshed for the time being." "Oh, thanks awfully, sir. May I go now, sir?" And Jennings ran out of the staff room to go and tell Darbishire the good news. Meanwhile, Mr. Wilkins was a little late in arriving back at school, for he had met Farmer Arrowsmith and had been obliged to stop and listen to a short lecture on the state of British farming. So he cut across the kitchen garden in order to save time. As he picked his way across the cabbage patch, he caught sight of two figures disappearing through the door of the woodshed. They were some distance away, but Mr. Wilkins had no difficulty in recognising them. After all, it was less than half an hour since he had seen them up a tree. His mood was volcanic as he altered his course and strode towards the woodshed door. Inside, Jennings had found the kettle. "Elmer's saved!" he cried in triumph. "Whizzo!" shouted Darbishire. Suddenly, the shed door screeched open on its rusty hinges, and Mr. Wilkins burst in like the advance guard of an armoured column. "Come here at once, you two boys!" he boomed, and in the confines of the tiny shed his voice sounded as though the armoured column was making the most of its heavy artillery. "Thought this would be a good place to hide from me, eh?" "We weren't hiding from you, honestly, sir." "Then what on earth were you doing?" Looking for a kettle of fish, sir." "We'll see what the head has to say about your deliberate attempts to be funny," said Mr. Wilkins. "And what's that you've got in your hand?" "It's the kettle of fish, sir," Jennings replied. It was not a very profound remark, but for the moment he could think of nothing else to say. The headmaster put the tips of his fingers together and frowned. "And what were Jennings and Darbishire doing with a kettle of fish?" "Apparently the kettle contained a goldfish which they were looking after for Bromwich Major," explained Mr. Wilkins. "And what was Bromwich Major doing with the goldfish?" asked the headmaster. "It took pride of place in his hut," said Mr. Carter. "Ah, his hut," murmured the headmaster. "I must admit that these huts concern me somewhat. I think hut building is an admirable outlet for all that surplus energy which bubbles up in boys," argued Mr. Carter. "In normal times, maybe," replied the headmaster, "but this is not a normal time." Mr. Carter and Mr. Wilkins both raised a quizzical eyebrow. "This morning I had a letter from General Merridew. He's bringing his daughter-in-law and his grandson down to see the school on Friday. I shudder to think of the General's remarks if he finds boys wandering about clutching kettles of fish or plastered in mud, building huts." "Yes, but," began Mr. Carter. "Nevertheless, I shall keep an open mind on the subject," the headmaster said. "After prep, I shall take a stroll down to the pond and see this hut-building activity for myself." There was great excitement in Jennings and Darbishire's hut, because the periscope was finished and very nearly worked. Those with keen eyesight were almost sure that they could see objects moving at a distance. Darbishire's eyesight was not keen, but his imagination was good. "I can see someone coming across the suspension bridge," he explained as he peered into the periscope. "It looks like Binns Minor to me." It was not Binns Minor. It was M.W.B. Pemberton Oaks, Esquire, M.A., Oxon, headmaster. Soon word had passed from hut to hut. Archbeaker on the prowl, and everywhere a frantic tidying up was in progress. No effort was spared to give the unexpected visitor a favourable impression. When Mr. Pemberton Oaks reached Jennings' little hut, he stopped. "Good evening, sir," said Jennings and Darbishire, in restrained tones. "Good evening. So, these are the huts of which Mr. Carter speaks so highly. I cannot think why you should choose the muddiest corner of the school grounds for the erection of these, sorry-looking shanties of twig and bulrush. I am further at a loss to understand, Jennings, why you should be standing in a puddle with only one shoe on. I'm sorry, sir, I didn't notice the puddle, and I've been using my other shoe to hammer our periscope into shape, sir." No one could say that Mr. Pemberton Oaks was not thorough. At the expense of a ruffled dignity and damp patches on both knees, he crawled inside the little hut to make a close inspection. Once inside, he found nothing to which he could take exception, and he had decided that perhaps Mr. Carter was right, and there was, after all, no reason why these innocent pleasures should not be followed in moderation. Indeed, if the headmaster had left the hut then and there, all might still have been well, but it was not to be. He noticed a hole leading to the small back room. Now, what could that be? He was halfway through the entrance when he realised that he was stuck. He tried to move forwards, and a shower of reeds and brambles fell upon him from the roof. He tried to move backwards, and the movement loosened the ventilating shaft, which Jennings had not had time to replace securely. Distinctly annoyed, Mr. Pemberton Oaks tried to struggle to his feet. As he rose, the walls rose with him, the roof caved in, and the ventilating shaft toppled forward, pinning him to the ground in a welter of branches, bulrushes, and homemade furniture. A sack-like object dropped from above and landed a short distance in front of him. The headmaster could not move, but he could see, and what he saw on the sack-like object did nothing to improve his feelings. "Welcome to the Olde Worlde hut," it said.
Mark Williams was reading from Jennings' Little Hut by Anthony Buckridge, abridged by Roy Apps. It was a peer production for BBC Radio 4 by David Blount.